Hey, Walter Sorrells here with my final video about photographing knives. So this one's not going to focus on actual photographing of the knives, but on the post-processing that you can do to make the photograph that's in your camera look better once you put it on the web or wherever it is that you're going to end up using it. A lot of times people who are thinking about processing their photographs get kind of freaked out because they look at the price that they hear people talking about Photoshop, and so they go out and they look at the price of Photoshop and it's crazy expensive, and they say, oh my god, I can't afford to do this. Well, there are some really cheap programs out there. I'm not going to tell you names, but you can go to Staples or Office Depot or someplace like that and find them, and they're going to be perfectly good for doing what you need to do with pictures of knives. The caution that I would give you here is I'm not going to take you through one program and say here's exactly the steps that you do with this particular program and here's the terminology. What I'm going to do is take a series of pictures starting with one photograph in its kind of raw form, and then showing the various stages that I might go through in order to get something that looks a little bit better, that just pops a little more. And by doing this, I'm not going to show you all the terminology of the things that you're going to use in whatever program you use. And that way, as long as you know that you can do it, you can figure out how to do it on whatever program you've got. Okay, so I'm going to cover two images here. In keeping with the previous two videos I've done on the subject, one image will be a Western knife that was shown in the previous video, while the second will be a Japanese blade. As you'll see, they'll present very different challenges. First, we'll cover a Western type knife, this one featured in the first photo shoot. It's a simple drop point hunter with a micarta handle that I showed how to make in another video. Okay, so first let me mention that I'm using Lightroom as the program that I'm going to manipulate the photograph in. This is kind of a sister program to Photoshop, but lots cheaper. Lightroom's intended for photographic cataloging, which by the way is super handy for knife makers. I don't know about you, but I've shot literally tens of thousands of images of blades that I've made, and finding a particular picture of a particular blade without some kind of cataloging program is a massive pain. Anyway, Lightroom has some nice, relatively intuitive, and relatively easy to use photo editing functions. As I mentioned earlier, people always talk about Photoshop, but it's a very expensive program. There are lots of alternatives out there, so don't worry if it's beyond your budget. You've got lots and lots of choices. Alright, so let's start with this picture. Basically, I'm going to try and do two things here. One is just improve some flaws in the image. I intentionally started with an image that had some problems to begin with. And the other thing I'm going to try and do is improve the image once it's basically in a technically sound state. So, first, this image is a little overexposed. Again, normally I bracket my shot to get perfect exposure, but for the purposes of this video, I made some intentional errors in shooting that I'll want to correct. So the first thing I'll do is darken the exposure just a hair, probably less than half a stop. There. Again, an intentional flaw in the picture. I set the white balance incorrectly, so the photo is a bit too yellow. So I'll adjust the white balance. Now, if you're not familiar with what white balance does in a camera, basically it's intended to adjust to factor in the fact that different light sources are somewhat bluer or yellower depending on the type of light, be it sunshine, shade, halogen bulbs, fluorescent bulbs, whatever. So I nudge it a hair toward blue and I get something that looks a little whiter. Okay, one general point here is that I almost always shoot with the assumption that I'm going to crop. Cropping in photography just means chopping off the edges of the picture. So this means that I shoot the blade with a little bit more border around it than it needs. Why? Because you never know where you're going to put it. You might need a little extra space around the border. You might need one edge longer than another. You might want it to be rectangular standing up or rectangular going sideways. So you just provide a little extra space. So the first thing I'll do is crop the image to suit my intended purpose. In this case, it's just going on my website, so I want a nice tight shot of the blade that shows up the product. Voila, that's cropping. Boom, it goes from cluttered and busy to focused. Another thing you can do is increase the amount of color in the picture. This is generally referred to as saturation. Most of the terms I'll use will have some kind of button or slider in your program that will allow you to manipulate the exact value that I'm discussing in a really simple way, just kind of going up or down. In Lightroom, there's just a little slider that says saturation. So you increase the saturation, you get more color. Decrease it, and eventually you just end up with a black and white picture. In this case, I'll pump up the saturation just a hair. See, that makes that wacky looking handle material pop a little. Easy does it though. You don't want to just stand on the gas with saturation or you get something that looks kind of cartoonish. Okay, to the same end, I'm going to add just a hair of contrast. Again, just a little slider that makes the light parts lighter and the dark parts darker. I'm just doing a tiny bit to make the image a little more dramatic. It's not a big deal, but it's the sort of thing that when you add it to a lot of other insignificant changes, starts to add up to a much improved image. Okay, I'm also going to do something called sharpening. The effect it has on an image like this is it just gives a little more hardness, a little more clarity, a little more focus to the edges. And that makes the whole image pop. Again, in most programs, there's a little slider that says sharpening, and I just nudge it over a little. Easy does it though. If you go too hard with the sharpening, it'll cause all kinds of ugly, grainy stuff to appear. So, different programs do this next effect in different ways, but everything I've done so far was applied to the whole image. In most programs, though, you can also apply effects to a small area by sort of highlighting an area and then applying a different effect just to that limited area. In Lightroom, there's something called a paintbrush tool, which lets you make local changes like that. In Photoshop, it's called a selection tool. Different programs do it in different ways. Okay, so here's the issue, and this is common on a lot of knives. If you have a satin finish, as this one does, from certain angles the knife blade will look sort of streaky. Now, I had better images straight out of the camera, but in this case I wanted to take one that had some flaws and fix them. So another thing that happens sometimes is that you may get oil or other residues on the blade that can cause streaks, maybe a little bitty reflection of something that doesn't look good. All these are things that nobody would notice in real life, but on a photograph their effect is very exaggerated and it looks bad, so we want to get rid of them in the blade without disturbing any other part of the image. So I highlight the blade with my image tool just by sort of painting over it. In Lightroom, there are a couple of things that I could use, one of which is called luminescence and another of which is called skin softening, which are mostly used to make women's skin look less wrinkly, which is probably the whole reason Photoshop was invented in the first place. Anyway, the same thing can be used to make knife blades look smoother. So, I really jack up the skin softening slider, and look how nice and smooth that blade looks all of a sudden. Now, at this point, I'm almost done. All I want to do now is marginally increase the focus of the image on the blade. I've used some props here. I've got my Glock 19 and the little 9mm rounds and a magazine sitting there and stuff. And that makes my blade look really badass, but I want the blade to be the focus, not my Glock, right? So I'm going to darken the edges of the picture slightly. Now there are a ton of things you can do here. You can mask or paint or select the gun and then decrease the contrast slightly on the background elements. You can blur the rest of the picture a tiny amount. There are a bunch of things you can do to sort of increase the focus just on that one element, the knife, that you really want to see. But here's something simpler. I'm just going to darken the edges of the picture a little. This is known in photo speak as vignetting. Now there are two ways to do this, and I'll show both. First, most programs have a vignette function. You can just sort of click on it or set it and it lets you control how dark the vignette gets. In other words, how much the edges go dark and how slowly or how quickly that darkness tapers off. Like this. Yuck, too much. Okay, that's better. But there's an alternative. In Lightroom, there's a function called a graduated filter, which is a thing that applies effects that gradually peter out as they move across the image. And you could apply this to all kinds of different things, contrast, blur, whatever. In this case, we'll just change the exposure. So I pull a series of graduated filters off the edges in different parts of the image, and they're all set to that slider that can increase or decrease exposure, i.e. make the image darker or lighter. So I just pull some graduated filters in and I darken from the edges. The advantage of graduated filters over straight vignetting is that there may be parts of the picture that you want to darken a little more than others, or elements you'd particularly like to bring down, and this allows you to tailor things a little more than a simple vignette, which is always going to be symmetrical. Look in a magazine and you'll see that every single image of a knife goes really dark towards the edges. Okay, so that's where I'm going to quit. So here's a real crap image. Now here's one that I've shot that's better than that original image, but it can be photoshopped to be even better, right? So this is the final result. Much improved. Now, let's turn to a Japanese blade. As I mentioned in one of the previous videos about shooting blades, Japanese blades have to be shot in a totally different way from Western knives, and these raise some different challenges in terms of the final image. Okay, so here's a blade I made recently. Looks okay as far as it goes, but we just want to tighten it up a little. Of course, I used all the techniques here that are shown in my earlier video about how to shoot pictures of Japanese blades. But now we're going to move on and improve that image just a little bit. So, first I'm going to rotate the angle just a hair. I want the tip and the end of the tang, or nakago as it's known in Japanese, to be dead even. It's a small thing, but it makes a subtle difference in whether your eye says, hey, this looks like a balanced blade, or something looks a little out of whack here. So, next, I'll crop out the background so that we can focus attention just on the blade. Okay, now this is something that's not unique to Japanese blades, but because of the way Japanese blades are photographed, it's more exaggerated here. Until you take pictures of Japanese blades, you'll just never know exactly how much crap is floating in the air around us. Because of the way Japanese blades are lit, dust just shows up like crazy. I don't care how clean your house is, unless you live in a semiconductor factory, the second you finish cleaning your blade, it'll be covered with tiny little dust nibs. And the way that we light Japanese blades when we're photographing them, they just show up like crazy on the blade. So we want to get rid of those. So I'll use a little tool in Lightroom called a spot remover. Most programs have some kind of similar tool. It might be called spot healing or something similar. But basically what it allows you to do is place a little dot over whatever it is that you want to remove, and then it just pulls from some part of the image close by that has similar colors and similar shapes in it and replaces the part that has the dust or whatever it is you want to remove. So you just click on each little piece of dust and boom, it's gone. It takes a lot of clicking to get rid of it all. So, finished with the dust. Next, I'll increase the exposure a hair. This is really kind of a matter of taste. I bumped it up 0.2 f-stops, which is almost imperceptible, but it just looks better to my eye. Next, I'll increase the contrast just a hair to make the hamon pop a little bit. Now, the way that I light my Japanese blades, they tend to be bright toward the tip and the tang, and then darken in the middle. I could solve this problem by using a really complicated lighting setup, but I shoot so many pictures of blades, I don't want to have to put 16 lights out every single time I do this. So, this is what I'm left with. Anyway, there's an easier way of fixing it. Now, a short blade, a tanto like this, doesn't have a big problem, but if you're photographing a katana, there's really a very noticeable drop in the light level toward the middle of the blade. So we talked about gradient filters earlier. I'm going to use that same little technique. So I'll use the gradient filter to decrease the exposure toward the edges of the picture, and that'll have the effect of evening out the light across the blade. Beautiful. Except the thing looks a little murky now because I've decreased those edges. It just looks a little dim. So I'll bump up the overall exposure in the picture by 0.65 f-stops. Now your program may not express exposure in f-stops, that just happens to be how mine does it, but it doesn't really matter. All you're trying to do is make it look good to your eye. And that's it, done. So we started here and ended here. Basically all I've done is take out some distractions so that somebody who's looking at this can focus on the blade and it's not going to get carried away with, oh boy, what are all these little dust nibs on there or something. It's just clear and simple. Are there other things you can do to your images? Absolutely. I'd encourage you to look at images of knives in magazines like Blade, then compare your own images and try to figure out how you can make yours look as good as theirs. The tools are all there. It's just a matter of learning how to do it. So, what's the takeaway here? Modern digital photography gives you the ability to produce incredibly good images of your blades straight out of the camera. But once the image comes out of the camera, there's so much more that you can do in a program like Photoshop or Lightroom or whatever you want to use to manipulate that program. And it's really not that hard. Once you really spend some time working with, say, 10 or 20 photographs and trying to get them really right, all of a sudden you'll have it down to a science and you'll be able to clean up an image like this in about 3 minutes. That's less time than it takes for you to put away your tools after a good day's work in the knife making shop. Given that a good image of your blade is the single best sales tool that your knife has, it's 3 minutes extremely well invested. Hope you're enjoying this series of videos. If you did, check out my website, waltersorrellsblades.com, where you'll find lots more videos in this vein, along with plenty of examples of my own work. Also, like my page, Walter Sorrells Blades, on Facebook. Thanks for watching.